I'm Daniel Weinberg, and we're at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop with virtual book signing. Welcome. It's very hot here, and probably where you are as well, so sip your martini and enjoy it while we swelter here under the lights. Remember that we're live right now, and if you'd like to email in a question while we are live, please feel free to do it. Give us at least your first name and where you're from so we can shout out to you and thank you. Of course, this will go on the archive, and if you're watching the archive, we may still have books signed for you, first editions as usual. So do call in if you'd like a copy or three. And we have a nice audience here coming out of the heat, so we hope to have a good show for you today. Two interesting books, that's all there is to it. And two interesting authors, I think, too. The first is Chris DeRose, who's an attorney and political strategist for 16 years. He's helped elect candidates across 5 different states, a campaign manager for Congressman Sean Duffy, and director of Election Day operations for the governor of Virginia. His other book is Founding Rivals, Madison versus Monroe, the Bill of Rights, and the Election That Saved a Nation, which was named by the Washington Post one of the best political books of 2011. Maybe we should have you back for that. His latest book is Congressman Lincoln, The Making of America's Greatest President. Threshold Editions, a division of Simon & Schuster, publishes it. It's 335 pages and $26. As well, we have John Rodrigue, who is here, Lawrence and Teresa Salamano Professor of History at Stonehill College in Eaton, Massachusetts. He's the author of several books and scholarly works, including Reconstruction in the Cane Fields, From Slavery to Free Labor in Louisiana's Sugar Parishes, 1862 to 1880. His latest book you're looking at, Lincoln and Reconstruction, by Southern Illinois University Press, 163 pages, it is $19.95. This is part of the Concise Lincoln series that SIU is putting out, and we've had a number of authors on this series, and we hope you will try to get every one of them. They're pithy and interesting, and I think probably maybe a joy, but certainly like writing the Gettysburg Address, what don't you put in? How do you make it that pithy? And these books seem to do it. What I usually do, and I'm going to do it right here quickly, how did each of you get to your book and this particular book at this particular time? Chris, why don't you start out?
Sure. Well, Abraham Lincoln had 3 political offices in his life. He was a state legislator, he was a member of Congress, and he was president of the United States. And I didn't write this book because I wanted to be the 16,000th person to write a book about Abraham Lincoln. I wrote it because I wanted to read more about his time as a member of the House. When he shows up in Washington to be inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, he has perhaps less formal experience than maybe anyone who came before him and anyone who came after him. And all that he knew about Congress, all that he knew about what a president was and what a president does, he learned during these 2 years from 1847 to 1849. And so I thought that would be a fascinating opportunity to look, because there hadn't been a book on this subject in 40 years. And so when that happens, as an author, you see an opportunity to write it for yourself.
No, we needed it very badly, and I'm glad you did that for all of us in the Lincoln field. By the way, he was elected to captaincy in the Black Hawk War.
That's true.
So that was his first elective office, and I had his first elective signature years ago, where he signed himself A. Lincoln, Captain, in Beardstown. So,
and he considered that the biggest honor of anything that he held between that and the presidency.
Of all the successes I've had, that's the one that's given me the most pleasure. So
that's right.
John, tell us how you got to your book and with the SIU Press.
Okay, a confluence of things. I never imagined myself writing a book about Abraham Lincoln, though I had been thinking about the questions of slavery and emancipation and the abolition of slavery for much of my professional life. And so I guess it was a few things. My previous institution at LSU, I used to teach a class on Louisiana history, in which I devoted a lot of attention to Lincoln's Reconstruction efforts in that state, since New Orleans had fallen fairly early in the war. So I talked a lot about the topic there, in other classes that I taught. And then when I moved up to my present institution, Stonehill College, I had the opportunity to develop some new classes, one of which was a class that I actually, let's just say, borrowed from my graduate mentor, Jim Rourke at Emory University, who had developed a class on Lincoln, and I always thought that was a pretty cool idea. So when I moved up to Stonehill, I developed my own seminar on Lincoln, and that's where I kind of got the Lincoln bug. And then the third thing, I guess, was I had the opportunity to write a review for a publication, Lincoln Lore, that at the time was edited by Sarah Gabbard, who was one of the editors of the Concise Lincoln Library series. And I wrote this review of her for her, and it was actually of Drew Faust's book, This Republic of Suffering. And she liked that review so much that she said, she said to her one of her other co-editors, Richard Etchelwain, let's ask John to do the book on Lincoln and Reconstruction. I at first said there are a lot other people more qualified to talk, Bill Harris or somebody else, but they said, no, we want you to do it. And so I thought about it for a little while and said, I've been thinking about these things for a long time, some of these questions, and I thought it would be kind of a fun opportunity. So I went ahead and did it, and the rest is, I guess, history.
It's history, and it worked. I'm going to ask each of you a little bit about this book, about your books. One of them, very quickly, why no illustrations?
No illustrations in mine? It's a decision the publisher made.
That was not a decision that you thought you wanted, they made that decision?
Yeah.
Well, kind of surprised. What are some of the sources? What secret diaries that you found and other correspondence of Lincoln's colleagues that are cited that had not been cited before?
I'm glad you asked that, Daniel. The hardest thing for someone who wants to write about Lincoln is how do you add value to the Lincoln story when there have been so many smart people out there who have been researching and writing about Lincoln their entire lives. What do you do? What can you actually add to the Lincoln story? And so the one thing I realized that nobody had really done before, not exhaustively anyway, was to visit all the repositories where his colleagues in the 30th Congress had letters. These people he served with weren't independently famous, but about 90 of them left behind a paper trail. Anything, letters, diaries. And so there was a guy, for instance, a guy in North Carolina at Chapel Hill called David Outlaw. He was a congressman from North Carolina. He's so obscure we can't even find a picture of him. But he hated being in Congress, and he wrote his wife once, maybe twice a day, just these long letters detailing everything that had happened in Congress that day. And so a lot of behind-the-scenes information. I was able to place Lincoln at meetings that no one ever knew he attended. There's some reaction to the spot resolution speech in there. That was very exciting. So all over the country, looking at letters for people who were not famous, but who helped us shed light for the first time on Abraham Lincoln. One other person, I called the curator of a museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. This is a little bit out of the way from where I'm planning to be, but one of Lincoln's housemates, one of the people he lived with during the 30th Congress, had papers there. And so I talked to the curator. I said, do you have a finding aid? I need to know if this is going to be worth my time to make it all the way down there. I said, is there someone who's used this maybe recently? Well, Abraham Lincoln's housemate, one of his housemates in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, has his papers there, and no one in 30 years had ever come and looked at them. And he was someone who lived with Lincoln. This was John Strom. Someone who even subsequently became, I believe, the governor of Pennsylvania. But in 30 years, no one had ever looked at the 200 some odd letters he'd written while Lincoln was his roommate.
Interesting. All right, so that's new stuff in this book,
Yeah.
which Riddle never had and probably never thought about doing either, maybe.
No.
John, you don't rely on speculation here, but you delve into Lincoln's own thoughts and conduct, for that matter. How did you approach the book then? And to be able to put together in such a concise form such a huge project?
Well, that's an interesting question. Believe it or not, there's been a lot written on Lincoln and Reconstruction, and any number of books. And so, in a way, it was an opportunity to provide an overview of this literature that's already existing. As I noted, a lot of stuff on Lincoln and his efforts in Louisiana, and so especially there's been a number of works that focus specifically on Louisiana. So I didn't really have to worry about source material or anything like that. But as I began to think about this, I thought, rather than just providing an overview, let me, see if I can provide a little different take, a little different twist on the literature. So it's designed. These books are designed to be short, designed to be an overview, a brief introduction, as it were. But they're also, if you want to be, you can be interpretive. And so I wanted to do that and thought I would, take this and try to put forward a particular interpretation of Lincoln and Reconstruction.
Well, we'll try to get into that as well, but I really want to continue on with this for a moment. Here is Ella Lon's book on Reconstruction in Louisiana, 1918. It's a real classic of its time, scholarly, of course, for its time, and definitive for its time. I'm going to read the first sentence and ask you about this. Fascinating first sentence that starts this out. And I'm going to ask you then at the end, how has literature on Reconstruction changed over the years and decades? This is how she begins the book, a brief resume of Reconstruction in Louisiana before 1869. By January 1, 1869, Louisiana had suffered the throes of Reconstruction for 7 weary years. But the hostile fates had decreed for her more than another 7 before she should be able to wrench herself free from the grasp of her colored and carpet-bag despots. So, there's a beginning to a book.
That's all you need to know there.
So, of course,
I'd have to read the rest of the book.
Birth of a Nation was
Well, that's it. I
in
mean,
the same time. So, tell us how it evolved, kind of briefly, from then
Yeah,
until.
I'll try to make this. I'll try to make this brief. I may not succeed, but that book is post-war Reconstruction, of course. But that is the quintessential statement of what we know to be the Dunningite interpretation from William A. Dunning, who was a historian in the early 20th century. And that's the story that, unfortunately, despite 50 years of revisionist scholarship, that's the story that most Americans still think of. Reconstruction as a disaster, the hateful, spiteful, radical Republicans led by Thaddeus Stevens, who was prominent in the Spielberg community. If Lincoln had been around, he would have stopped all of this. The black suffrage was imposed on the South as a form of punishment by these spiteful, hateful radicals, and that's Ella Lon that's standard interpretation for the historical profession and American society at large.
Did it change as the 20th century moved on?
Yeah, and I should note there were dissenting voices. W.E.B. Du Bois and others were trying to put forward a different interpretation. It didn't really get much play in the historical profession and American society at large. But around the middle of the 20th century, a new generation of historians motivated by different questions, the beginnings, well, not really the beginnings, but the modern civil rights movement really gaining momentum, historians went back and began to re-examine Reconstruction and in effect turn that interpretation on its head. Andrew Johnson was no longer the defender of constitutional principles, but he was a small-minded racist, even by 19th century standards. The radical Republicans were no longer the hateful, spiteful, vindictive, just want to punish the South, but in fact, in many respects, idealist, in wanting to bring about genuine change to the South. And now how Lincoln fits within that interpretation is another interesting story, because the Dunningites, they like Lincoln because they see Lincoln as benevolent, wanting to let the South off easily, is not looking to punish the South. And so therefore, if we had only followed Lincoln's model, and in fact that's what Johnson was trying to do for the Dunningites, and Ella Dunn is trying to implement Lincoln's plan. That is not really entirely the story, and part of what I'm doing here is trying to explain Lincoln had some other ideas about what the South and what the country was going to look like after the war.